In this video, we're going to be making a woven wall hanging that combines a stitch that looks like this with a pick and pick stitch that looks like this. So let's get started. To get started on this weaving, I'm going to be using 8/8 cotton warp string. This is the thickest warp string that I use. I'm going to be warping on 52 warp strings double warped. So that means there's going to be 2 strings between each notch. I'm using a 4 ends per inch loom, so that in turn makes it so there's 8 ends per inch. I'm gonna be weaving this upside down because I want to have the perfect amount on one end to wrap the strings around my dowel. So I'm actually going to put my loop at the top of my loom instead of the bottom. Every loom will be a bit different for this part, but I'm starting on the I'm starting on the 5th peg in, and I'm going to the 5th space on the bottom. From here, this is where I'll start going 2 strings in between each of the notches. Now that I have 52 warp strings on my loom, I'm gonna cut off the excess string, leaving myself a nice long tail, and I'm gonna tie a triple knot onto this last warp string. Next, I'm taping down my loom with some painter's tape. Now we need to figure out how much room I'm going to need at this end for my dowel. I've done this a million times, but I'll quickly show you what I'm doing. I'm really liking 7/8 inch thick dowels. I don't know why, just really like the way they look. So to figure out how much I need to leave at the bottom, which will become the top of my piece, I'm going to take my warp string, create a nice big loop. It's still on the spool, you don't have to cut this. Then I'm gonna open up this loop. I'll show you over here where you can see better. I'm gonna fold that over and then grab these 2 loops, which creates a lark's head knot. Then I'm going to slip that onto the dowel, tighten it up. Then I'm gonna hold my fingers about where I want the top of the weaving to be. So for me, this ends up being about a 1/2 inch to 3/4 of an inch. I'm not too precious about that measurement, but I do like there to be a little bit of space so it's easier to get these loops onto the dowel. Then I can slip that off and I can open up the loop. And I can grab my measuring tape and measure the length of this loop. So in my case, it's about 3.5 inches. So I've done this before and got 3.25. Again, it's not too specific. And I think this piece of cardstock will get me to that 3.5. So I'm happy with that. I'll measure this out for you. This is what I'm going to weave into the base of my weaving so that I have something sturdy and straight to beat the weft down onto. So this one is 3.1/8 inch. So I'm now gonna take this cardstock and I'm going to be weaving this in just under 2, over 2, or over 2, under 2, it really doesn't matter, all the way across my loom. Once you've woven a number of rows, you can take this out if you find that it's making your warp a little bit too tight, but I generally am able to leave it in for the majority of the weaving. So I'm gonna slip this in and I'm gonna push it all the way down. I am gonna re-measure. So this probably ended up, actually it's about perfect. It's just under 3.5 inches, so I'm happy with that. Next, I'm going to take the first yarn that I'm gonna be using. I'm gonna be using these 2 colors of this yarn. This is called Patons Inspired, and it is considered a bulky weight yarn. Now, all yarn thicknesses kind of have a range, but this one is definitely decidedly thicker than a worsted weight, but it's definitely thinner than something like Lion Brand Woolly's Thick and Quick, which is this one. So you can see that this one is probably about half the thickness of this one. Most of the time when I'm weaving, I work with a max of 3 of my arm's lengths at a time. I find that's the most manageable amount that allows me to weave for a while, but doesn't get too in my way. So I'm going to thread that into my tapestry needle, and I will be using 2 tapestry needles for this since we're going to be doing pick and pick. So you're constantly going back and forth between each yarn. This part's gonna be a little annoying with this much yarn, but I'm gonna use it anyway. And also, actually, I just realized that was dumb. I don't need this much yarn. Okay. Okay, I'm actually gonna scrap what I said because I realized that we're weaving the pick and pick in sections, so I don't need this much yarn all at once. I'm gonna make my life a little bit easier, and I'm going to do this 1, 2, and then 5 more widths. 1, 2, 5. And I'm gonna cut that off, and I can leave this for later. Now I'm going to take that yarn and I'm going to be weaving over one, under one, all the way across my loom, and then do a twining stitch on top of that plain weave row. I will leave a tutorial right here for how to do a twining stitch. Now that that first row of plain weave is in there, I'm gonna push it down with my weaving comb just a little bit, just so it's closer to where I'm gonna leave it, and then I'm gonna start my twining stitch. You'll notice as I go, I'm tightening up that twining stitch so it really locks those warp strings in place. Now that I have my twining stitch in place, I can do my first row of the pick and pick. Now here's where we're going to be doing something a little bit different. We're going to be weaving in over 2, under 2. This is because with this warp set and this thickness of weft, we want to do that so that the yarns themselves completely cover up the warp strings. So for this first row, since my weft is going underneath the warp, I'll start going over. So I'm going to go over 2, under 2, all the way across my loom. As always, I'm going to make sure that that weft is snug against my warp strings. I'm going to create an arch, strum my warp, and then use my weaving comb to push down the weft all the way to that twining stitch nice and firmly. Now I can grab my other color of yarn, which is going to be this beautiful yellow. This is the same yarn. You do want to make sure that whatever yarn you use is the same thickness as each other, or it's not going to quite have the same effect. Now that could be a feature if you wanted it to be, but I'm going to be using the exact same yarn for both colors. So now I'm going to measure out 5 widths because we'll be doing 5 rows, 1, 2, 5, plus a little bit. And I'm going to grab my second tapestry needle and thread my yarn into that. Now this time, in an effort to not have all the ends on one side, as well as I like to start, if I can, my row going over the warp strings, which is what we would need here, I'm going to start on the left side. So I'm going to go over 2, under 2, all the way across the loom. And same thing as last time, I'm going to create this arch, strum my warp, and then push down that weft firmly onto the previous row. Now here's where it gets a little tricky. We need to go back to the white, but if we go back to the white and we just leave this tail hanging out, what we'll do is we won't be going around these strings at all, because we need to do the same thing with the white row we did back here, up here again. So we have to loop this around the yellow. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to have the yellow on the bottom like so, and I'm bringing the white over top so that it loops around the yellow. And I'll show you what that looks like here. So now we're going under 2, over 2. I'll just go partway across the loom so you can see this edge. And you'll see now that white is hooking on to the yellow. So I'm gonna pull that pretty snug. Now, doing pick and pick does make the sides of your piece not always as tidy as if you were just doing plain weave, but that's totally normal because we have to do this looping around the sides. So I'm gonna have that looped here. I'll go all the way across my loom, create that arch, strum the warp, and push it down onto the previous row. So now we're gonna be doing that again. So I'm bringing this yellow over top of the white so that it's going to loop around it. Now I'm going under 2, over 2, weaving all the way across the loom. And you can see that that yellow is looped around the white. Now I can take my white and go over 2, under 2, back across the loom. So I'm going to repeat that again, having my yellow looping around the white, and I'm going to keep repeating this until I have 5 rows of each color. So a total of 10 rows of the pick and pick, not counting the twining. I'm also going to be paying attention to my sides, making sure that I'm not allowing those warp strings to come in a lot. If you find that they are coming in a lot, it probably means you're not leaving enough slack in your weft. So to get slack in your weft, that's created by this arch. Now, is there an exact science to how much of an arch you need? No, this is something that sort of comes over time, but this is about how much I'm doing on mine. So you're up about 2 inches or so at the middle of the arch. You're strumming it because that helps sort of spread the slack around. And then what I typically do is I start beating down in the middle and then I go over to the sides. The other thing that I do as well is sometimes when I've created that arch, I'll actually grab the sides of my weaving and sort of pull. That's also just another way that it sort of spreads out that slack. So this will be my last row of the white. So you can see 1, 2, 3, 4. This will be the 5th. Now this string will tuck around nicely because the yellow was looped around it, but on this side where I've ended on the over, I'm just gonna go ahead and loop this back around, just so that when I go to tuck that in the back, it'll look a little bit tidier on the edge. So I'm gonna go ahead and cut off the excess, leaving a nice long tail that I can tuck in later. I can set the scraps aside. I'm gonna do the same thing on this side. And now I'm going to grab my wool roving. So for the wool roving, I'm using this beautiful blue color. I will list the tools and materials in the description box below. I like to split my wool so that it goes a lot further. So in this case, this is a really long piece. I'm gonna just take what will be 1 width. And when you pull wool apart, you need to spread your hands apart like this because the staple or the fur, the individual hairs are really long. So it's easier if you put your hands further apart and you just gently pull. So now I'm going to take this, and even this is a little bit too long, but that's okay for this first one. And I'm going to split it about in half. So I just kind of found a split point that felt about half on each side. And I'm going to gently let it just pull apart. Then we're going to take one of those halves and we're going to be weaving this in over 4 under 4. So I'm gonna go over those 4 warp strings, grab 4, skip 4, go under 4. So it's just plain weave, but it's 4 at a time instead of 1 or 2 like we have been doing so far in this piece. Now we want to have tails on each end, and you still do want to create a bit of an arch with this wool so that it doesn't overcrowd the warp. And then I'm just gonna push that all the way down. And then these ends will get tucked in later. So for this one, I could pull it off a little bit because it's a bit long, but I'm not gonna do that now. I'll do that when I actually tuck in the ends later. Now, when I grab a new piece of wool, well, first I'll use this half. Then when I grab a new piece of wool, I'll try to go a little bit shorter. So for your reference, if you're using the same loom as me, you probably only need to go the full width of the loom. You just want to have enough excess on the sides that it's going to be decently easy to tuck it in later. Now I'm going to do that process minus the twining stitch over again. So I'm going to grab a width of the white, a width of the yellow, and I'm going to weave in 10 rows of the pick and pick stitch. Now I want all of my colored rows to line up throughout my whole weaving. So I'm going to be starting the exact same way I started before. So I'm starting on the right-hand side by going over 2, under 2. I'm going to be starting the last section of the pick and pick. I have 5 rows of my wool in. I thought that would look the most aesthetically pleasing, having an odd number of the wool, which is a little bit more prominent than the pick and pick. So I'm going to go ahead and do my last 10 rows of the pick and pick stitch, and then I'm going to end with a twining stitch like I did at the beginning. My warp is getting a little bit tight since I'm near the edge of my loom. So I'm going to go ahead and take this cardstock out, and that's going to release a little bit of the tension because this takes up some space in the warp. So now it's a bit looser and it'll be easier for me to weave. Plus I've woven so much at this point and I've done this nice twining stitch over here that this stuff shouldn't shift at all. For this twining stitch, after I do the row of plain weave, I'm going to start a new piece of yarn to do the actual twining stitch. And then we will meet back up when we're doing the fringe. All right, so I'm finished the whole weaving portion of this piece. So I have that twining stitch in there. Everything's good to go. This is the top. Now we're gonna flip it over and we're gonna tuck in all the ends. And then after that is when we're gonna add some of the base work as well as the fringe. One thing to remember when you're going to flip over your loom, therefore the piece will be actually resting on the front of it, is you want to clean everything up from underneath your loom. So I don't know if you can see it, but there's like a lot of fluff and little bits of yarn from when I was weaving. So I'm gonna quickly clean that up so that it doesn't get little pieces all over the front of my piece. All right, so now we're working on the back of the piece. So I'm gonna bring all of the ends from the front to the back. To tuck in the ends, I'm using 2 different yarn needles. So I have this plastic one that has a nice big eye. I'll be using that for the wool roving. And then this one that's a little bit slimmer and metal, I'm gonna be using for the yarn ends. Normally I would start with all the wool because it's the most bulky part, but the wool is gonna sort of cover up some of these ends. So we're gonna go ahead and do the yarn ends first. I'm just gonna grab one and show you how we're doing this. So we have 2 per pick and pick section. We have 2 ends on each side. So I'm gonna grab the first one and I'm gonna bring this over. Since we have 2 ends, I'm gonna be tucking in the yellow one into this channel and the white one into this channel. So I'm grabbing just the loops on the back of the piece. So right here, I'm only grabbing from the back, and we can flip it over to confirm. And you can see that we're not seeing that needle from the front of the piece, so we're good to go. Now, what I don't want to do is pull this too tight. See how it's making that warp string kind of go in? We don't want that. We want it to just be laying flat. So that looks good to me there. It's not pulling on this warp string. And then I can go ahead and trim this off. So when I trim it off, I'm not going to be trimming this roving. I'm not going to be trimming any of the other yarns. I'm going to trim nice and close to where I tucked it in without cutting anything else. So now I can grab the yellow end and do the same thing. So I'm going to be going up through these loops this time. And again, making sure that I'm not pulling this too tight so that it's sitting flush against the warp string but not tight, and then trim off the excess. Now we can flip this over and we can just confirm. We can look at this and know that we're not seeing those yarn ends in the front of the piece, so we're good to go with that. So now I'm gonna go ahead and do that exact same process with all of these other ends. All of the yarn ends are tucked in now, so we're gonna move on to the wool. So for this wool, what I'm gonna do is I'm taking that bigger plastic yarn needle because it has a bigger eye. It's a little bit easier to get the wool in there. And I'm going to weave this back in. So I'll go around these 2 and just grab the next 2. So then from there, I'm just gonna go under a couple. I don't have to go under both. And then here I'll go under the first 2. Then we're gonna pull this through carefully. Now I do want that to be tight against the weaving, but you can see that with that tightness, I'm really pulling it in. So I don't want that. You can see that this part is kind of buckling. So we just wanna place it so it's resting against the edge. And if I turn it around, you can see that that's looking pretty tidy there. And it is gonna kind of squish up like that, and it makes it match these. So I'm happy with that there. So after I have that tucked in, what I'm gonna do is sort of lift this up, and bigger scissors might be better for this part. I'm gonna lift that up and just sort of trim, leaving a bit of a tail. So you can see that it won't just immediately slip out of there. There's about a 1/2 inch here, and it's just gonna kind of floof up like this, and it should stay in place. This is a woven wall hanging, so ideally it's not getting handled too much after it's completed. So that will be enough to keep it in place. So now I'm gonna do the exact same thing with all the other wool ends. Okay, so now the back of my piece is all done. I've cut off the floof, and can we talk about how that's actually kind of cute? these little floofy bits. Maybe that needs to be the front of a piece at some point. But this is gonna be the front for this piece. So now we need to do the base work as well as the fringe before we take this off the loom. I'm gonna just quickly double check because I'm curious if I kept everything nice and straight. So at the top here, we've got about 6 inches. And at the bottom, we've got about 6 inches. So I'm happy with that. All right, so for the base work of this piece, I'm going to take some super bulky yarn. This is Lion Brand Woolies Thick and Quick. And I'm going to grab 4 widths of my piece, plus a little bit more. And I'm gonna thread that into my needle. And then now I'm going to be weaving over 2, under 2, all the way across the loom, and do a twining stitch over top of that. So I'm gonna keep this kind of low on the piece because we need to still add the fringe, and then we're gonna push everything up at the end. Okay, so now that I have the twining stitch finished, I'm gonna do 2 rows of plain weave on top of that. Now I have that base work done. So if you've watched my How I Start Every Weaving, we're kind of doing that now at the end of the piece because I wanted to weave it upside down. Now, in retrospect, if we actually measured this, and just for fun, we will, at the top, I have my 3.5 inches. And at the bottom, I have about 4 inches. So realistically, this piece could have just been woven as normal from bottom to top and it would have been fine. But it just really depends on how picky you are about the amount that you're leaving at the top of the piece for the dowel. I only do this method, weaving upside down, if the piece is going to be symmetrical. When I'm doing more of an organic woven piece, I like to weave from bottom up because I want to be looking at the piece the way that it's actually going to hang. I find it very confusing and weird for my brain if I'm trying to weave a piece like that upside down. But this one is completely symmetrical no matter how you look at it, so it would be fine to weave it in either direction. Let's move on to the fringe. Now, if you've been watching my videos for a while, you'll know that as of late, my favorite combination of fringe is 1 piece of 5mm recycled cotton string and 2 pieces of 2mm recycled cotton string. I feel like this is on a 4 ends per inch loom. It's a really well balanced fringe. I love an off-white fringe. I feel like it looks good on every piece. I'm not always a big fan of a colored fringe because it kind of becomes part of the actual weaving instead of sort of a trim for the weaving, if you will. And most of the time I'd rather just let the weaving speak for itself and the fringe be something that's just like a nice little addition. I don't know if that makes sense to anyone else, but it does to me. So because we double warped our loom, we're actually going to be tying each group of fringe around 4 warp strings at once instead of only 2. So I'm going to need 13 groupings of my fringe. So that'll be 13 pieces of the 5mm and 26 pieces of the 2mm. Now, as far as the length, it's a personal choice. You can go really long if you want the fringe to be more of a feature, or you can go really short. I've been liking shorter fringe. It uses less materials and I feel like it's easier to find places to hang a shorter piece, but maybe that's just me. And what I've been liking to do is to have my fringe be about half the length of the woven area so that in the end, the piece is approximately 2/3 weaving and 1/3 fringe. Now, I probably am gonna make this a little bit longer because we want to account for the knot that's gonna happen. And I like to make my fringe not perfectly straight. So I'm gonna go about this length. I'm gonna cut this and then I will measure it for you. I will be purposely not cutting every piece of fringe the exact same length. So this one is about 11 inches. So I'm gonna go ahead and cut all the pieces I need and then we'll get to tying on the fringe. All right, so I have all my fringe cut. I'm going to be grabbing 1 piece of the 5mm, 2 pieces of the 2mm, and I'm gonna just sort of line them up. They are, I'll just purposely grab a shorter one. So when they're shorter, I'm trying to basically line them up centered. So these ends are all about the same spacing apart, if that makes sense. So I'm gonna grab this grouping of fringe, working on 4 warp strings at a time. I'm gonna grab the 2 on the right, and I'm wrapping from right to left, half of the fringe, like so. Then I'm grabbing the left 2 strings and I'm wrapping from left to right. Then I'm going to kind of line up the ends. Mine happen to be pretty lined up. And I'm just gonna kind of pull that knot tight. Now we will be pulling this all up, pushing it all up at the end, but I can still kind of stop here and try to tighten up this knot. So I'm just grabbing each individual strand and sort of tightening them up a little bit. And then that way that knot becomes a little tighter. I can adjust this again later, but I'm just trying to make it so it's semi-tight right now, and then we'll tighten it up again later. So I'm gonna do that same process all the way across, working on 4 warp strings at a time. Okay, so the fringe is all on. It looks a little funny at the moment, but now we're gonna go through the process of pushing it up, and then we'll retighten all those knots. So I'm gonna start just carefully pushing up the fringe, and then I'm gonna push up all this base work. So I'm just using my weaving comb to do this. And we wanna make sure that that's looking straight based on the bottom of the loom. And then I'm gonna flip this over. That's looking pretty good. And now is where I can go back and kind of tighten up all the fringe a little bit more if it feels like it needs it. My knots are looking nice and even now. So I'm just gonna push this up one more time, make sure everything is nice and snug. Now, before I take this off the loom, I'm gonna go ahead and tuck in these ends of the base work that we put in. So I'm gonna take the first one using my bigger yarn needle just because it's a little bit easier. And I'm going to stitch this up through just the loops of the base work. But what I like to do, since there's not as many loops, is I'll kind of go back and forth. So now I'm going back down, and I might wanna go back up one more time. I'm not super precious about this. That would be enough what I just did, but I kind of just today feel like doing one more up there. So now I just need to do the same thing with this other end, and then I can trim off the excess. All right, so now we're ready to take the piece off the loom. If you have a loom like this and your warp is really, really tight, you can go ahead and undo the screws if necessary. I'm gonna try to slip the loops off of the loom. So what I like to do is grab onto the warp string here and just pull it towards the bottom to create some slack, and then that makes it easier and safer to slip those loops off. Now, if it's super, super tight, you do risk breaking your notches if you have a similar loom, so you just wanna be careful in that regard. You can also cut your piece off your loom. I like to leave as much length as possible to tie the knots on the bottom personally, but if it's really, really tight, cutting it off might be a safer route. I'm just gonna slip off a couple of those loops. I'm gonna tie these 3 strings together. So I'm doing an overhand knot, and then I'm just gonna push that knot up to meet with the twining stitch. So I don't want to pull it too tight that it's pushing the twining stitch up further. I'm just making them meet up with it. So then I'm going to grab the next 2 loops like so, and I'm going to do that again. So creating an overhand knot and pushing that knot snug against the twining stitch. So I'm going to do that all the way across. Okay, so at the end, I ended up being left with more loops than I was hoping. So I'm gonna try to tie these all together. So I kind of have 2 loops plus 1 more, well, just 1 more string. And I'm hoping I can loop them all together. What actually worked. Okay, so now I can slip my weaving off of the loom. I'm gonna set my loom aside. And normally what I do when I'm using a thinner warp string is I would go ahead and stitch all this warp string back up into this base work. But when I use a double warp with 8/8 cotton warp string, which is a thicker string, as you can see, it gets way too bulky to sew it back up. So I actually just trim it off, and you can trim off any piece if you don't like sewing it back in. I just do it when I can because I think it looks tidier. So in this case, since it is kind of bulky, I'm just gonna leave it about a 1/2 inch long. So I'm being careful not to cut the fringe at all. I'm just cutting the warp strings underneath the knots. I don't want to cut them too close to the knots because we don't want them to be able to slip out of the knots. Not that it's going to, because again, a woven wall hanging ideally isn't handled very much after it's completed, but I do want to make sure that just in case there is a little bit of excess there. And then I also obviously try to trim them off so they're approximately the same length because again, it just makes the back look a little bit tidier. Next, we're gonna attach the dowel to the piece. So I like to grab a stack of books, or in this case, just this spool holder, just something that's gonna weigh down your piece a little bit. I have cut my dowel. This is a 7/8 inch thick dowel, and it's about 7¼ inches long. So I just basically made it 1 inch longer than the width of my piece. I'm gonna be grabbing 2 loops at a time, and I'm going to open them up, stack them on top of each other, flip this over, and then slip this onto my loom, or onto my dowel. Now, I do have a little bit of excess, so I'm actually going to do one more step. So I'm opening those loops, flipping this forward, and I'm going to do an extra twist, like so. Then bring those 2 loops together. This creates a little bit of a braid effect, and it helps the loops stay tighter onto the dowel. I don't always have enough slack to do this, but in this case, I do, so I am gonna go ahead and do that. So you can see there, it's nice and tight, and then I can move on to the next 2 loops. So I'll show you one more time, and then I will just do the same thing all the way across. So grabbing 2 loops, stacking them on top of each other. I like to stack them the same way each time, so I'm doing the right one over top the left. We're gonna open up that loop, flip this forward, then I'm gonna do an extra twist, and then bring those 2 loops together and slip them onto the dowel. Next, I'm adding a hanging string. So much like with the fringe, I think I do the hanging string about the same, where I do it about half as long as the woven portion. That seems to work really well for me. And I'll show you quickly how I tie on the hanging string. So I leave a nice long tail. I wrap it around 3 times. So I'm gonna wrap it around once like this. Then I'm gonna go on the other side of the main string, and I might need to pull a little bit more slack, and then come back around and tie this in a knot. Now the first half of my knot, you can see that this tail is facing forward, but the second half of my knot, I wanna make sure it's facing backward. Just so that that little cut off tail will be towards the back of the weaving instead of the front. And then I leave, you know, a little bit of a tail again. I need to sharpen my scissors. And then I'm gonna do the same thing on the other side. Now, before I cut this string, I'm gonna make sure that I have the length that I want. So again, about half the length of the woven portion, right about there. I'm gonna wrap this around 3 times and then leave myself a nice long tail. And then I'm gonna do that same process I did on the other side. So wrapping it around once on this side of the main hanging string, and then I'm gonna bring the tail on the other side of the hanging string and then back around. I find that this just kind of helps keep this wrapped string together a little bit better. And then again, cut off the excess. Now we are at the very last step, and that is the fringe. So I'm gonna go ahead and flip the weaving around, comb out this fringe just using my fingers, just so that it's all laying approximately as flat as it can go. And then I'm gonna go across. I like my fringe to not be perfect, but I do want it to be somewhat even. So this piece is sticking out too much for me. So I'm gonna go ahead and cut that off. And I'm just gonna go across the weaving and sort of cut off any pieces that seem a little bit too long. You can also go ahead and kind of measure it just to see where you're at on each side. So the longest piece over here is about 5 1/4. So this is actually, my fringe ended up longer than I was thinking that it would. Would that look better? I could totally leave it this way, but I'm gonna go ahead and trim it down, and it's gonna be trimmed down quite a bit, and I'm gonna make the unevenness of it happen after the fact now, because again, I did cut it longer than I had originally intended to. It's all done, so let's have a look at the finished piece. I love the way that this turned out. Let me know what you think in the comments down below, and if you enjoyed this video, check out this one next.